Hey guys, welcome to the second video about top 12 loudspeaker companies. And today we are taking the period that is 1970 to 1990. That means, like the last time, I'm going up to the end of 89 and the 1990s starts on the third video coming later. But this is the second video, and in this video and on this list, there are many changes, but there is still a few brands that are on this list that was on the previous list just because of the market position that they had, and they had such an influence still on the market. And it's not many, but there is two or three of them that are still on this list. So let's start with the three that was on the previous list that is on this list as well. And I don't need to talk too much about them because I did that in the earlier video. But the three that is on here is, of course, Altec. Altec had a good run in the 70s and for the most parts of the early 80s. So they had a good market position still, and they still made good products, even though there were some changes corporate wise and of course product wise as well. They still had a presence in the market, they still had a huge influence on the market, and they had a good market share. So that's why they are still on this list. The second one is JBL. Yes, JBL was huge in the previous period of time on the other list. In this list, I mean, they were still doing great. They were still pumping out things in the 70s. They were still innovative. They still had a good market share, and they had a good presence in the market, both on the pro audio side. The pro audio side was in fact growing and becoming bigger and bigger and more of an influence than the hi-fi side. They still made good hi-fi products still, and they also started to in the 80s they started to adventure into car audio things. So they were still a company that was absolutely booming, and they deserve to be on this list as well. The third company that is on this list that was on the previous list is Vega. And Vega, for the same reasons as Altec and JBL, they were still growing. They become bigger. It was like in 1986 where Vega really took off. They had steadily been growing since the 1950, but in 1986 it was really the year when they moved from Arleta to Simi Valley, where things just exploded. They went from like 40 employees to like over 300 in a short period of time, and they really put up high pressure on the market. They sold tons of speakers. They had more models than they had in the previous period. So they absolutely deserve to be on this list. Now we come to the newcomers. These are the companies that kind of grabbed the 70s and the 80s and started shaping this market and speaker production and speaker company things to come for decades and years, even today. And let me just start. Like, there's the same with this list. I'm not ranking any of these brands over any other brands on the list, so they're just in random order. I leave the ranking up to others. If your brand is on here, great. If it's not, well, there's a reason why. These are the companies that had a huge presence in the market, and they came on the scene and they made such a huge splash, and they showed the speaker world and the speaker business and the audio business something new and something exciting, and they made an impact on the market. That's why they are on this list. So let's just dive straight into it. In the 1980s, 82, 83, something around there, a Danish company came on the market and made headlines, and they made some really good stuff, and they kept on doing this for the rest of the 80s. And they will for sure be on the next list, which is like the 90s up to 2000 something, 2010, something like that. But in the 80s, they came on the market and they made a splash right off the bat, and they kind of like took the throne away from some of the other Danish companies that had been on the market before. This was the new Danish kid on the block, where a lot of people, especially in Europe, I'm not sure how it was here in the over the pond here in the United States, North America, but in Europe they got a good stronghold fast, and we're talking about Dolly. Uh, they made some killer products, killer speakers, and they still do to this day. I have been such fortunate to have owned several pairs of Dolly. I have also been to their factory a couple of times. And it was because they had a tight cooperation with Søren Vega. Dolly was owned by Audio Nord. Audio Nord was a Søren Vega distributor in Europe. They had Søren Vega head office was in their same building as Dolly. So I was fortunate enough to go down there a couple of times and visit the factory and walk around and look at stuff. Dolly absolutely deserves to be on the list, even though they came on a little bit later in this period. They came on fast and furious, and they made an impact. Advent. Advent was a brand that really got a good stronghold in the 70s. Um, they did some really good models, and they got attention really fast, just the same as Dolly. They got attention fast, and probably because Henry Kloss was behind, one of the guys behind it, and they made some killer good stuff. My favorite Advent model is the one that is called, not the OLA, the original large Advent, but the smaller Advent. I like the smaller Advent. I have had it. I just sold a pair, shipped them off a couple of days ago, and I really like the sound in those, even better than the OLA. So Advent, even though they kind of went downhill pretty fast when it comes to quality, because they sold out not long. Well, they were on the market for many years, but compared to many other brands, they kind of like, they popped up, they did well, they did some good stuff, and then later on they sold off, and things started to change, and it never became the same again. They ended up being owned by Jensen, and then Jensen and all this whole balloon of companies that was involved with that was bought out by someone else, and there was, at the end of it, they were bought out by holding companies, and that's how it is today. You can find Advent products today, but it's not even nearly the same as the old stuff. So Advent in the 70s, somewhat early 80s was well, or 70s was good. The stuff in the 80s was okay. The 90s Advent, shy away. So they are on here. Another company that really came on the market, it came on the market in the last period of speaker thing that I did, because these came on the market in the earlier part, first half of the 60s. But I didn't include them in the previous list because they kind of like, they worked themselves up in the 60s, and they became more and more and more of a household name the later in the 60s. And then when it tipped into the 70s, that's when the market really started to embrace this brand, and we're talking about Bowers and Wilkins. So in the 70s and 80s and 90s and even today, Bowers and Wilkins has always been looked at and highly regarded as some of the best speakers you can have. So yes, 70s and 80s, Bowers and Wilkins, absolutely good stuff, and they deserve to be on this list. The reason I didn't include them in the previous list was because their foothold, their impression on the market, their impression among listeners and customers really started happening more and more as we progressed into the later 70s. So they deserve to be on this list for sure. Today they have sold out again. They were sold a couple of years ago, I think it was, maybe 1, 2, 3 years ago. And the new owners have promised that they will keep the tradition of building high quality stuff. So we'll have to see how it turns out. But Bowers and Wilkins, I mean, in the 70s and 80s, they pumped out a lot of great stuff. We can now go to another company that also made a splash, and that's Magnapan with their Magnaplaner speakers. They were accepted fairly fast, and they were also regarded as some of the better that you could get when it came to electrostat speakers and stuff like that. And they quickly developed a following among many people. A lot of people didn't like it, but a lot of people did. Me personally, I'm not a big fan of them. They are too demanding. They demand huge amount of powers, big amplifiers, and they do indeed demand a lot of the room. You have to have large rooms with. You want to have high ceiling heights. You want to have the speakers pulled out from each and every wall that's around them. So they're kind of like demanding speakers in that way. Not everyone can have them. They're not suited for everyone because some people don't have the space to do it. Some people don't want to go and buy thousands of dollars amplifiers just to drive them, because they will suck your amplifier dry if you don't have a good amplifier. But the thing was, they started to create a trend, and I want to say that they took it a step further from Quad that I had on the previous list. So absolutely, Magnepan is a company that really created a big following over a span of 10, 15, 20 years that still lives on today. So they absolutely are on this list. Like I said, I have heard them, and they are. I mean, there's some good sounding speakers, but like I said, they're very demanding, and you have to have a subwoofer or two to go with them, because there's not much bottom end in them. So they're kind of like it's not a flaw or a production flaw or anything like that. It's just how that type of speaker is. But if you have the room, the space, and you want to partner them up with some subwoofers, yeah, you can create some really good sounding systems with them. So they are here, that's for sure. The next one on the list is PSB. They came on the market in 1972, made in Pickering, Ontario, Canada. They also came on the market in a very, very busy period of time. 1971, 1972, 73, 74 was a lot of new brands and a lot of new innovations being pumped out on the market in the audio world, and PSB was one of them. And they grabbed attention fast. They were like a 100-meter dash runner in the Olympics. They came to the starting line and they just took off. They hit a type of market that I think people, because you have to remember, the audiophile thing started to really, really groom itself and grow in the mid to later part of the 70s. That's when you start to see the shift between audio enthusiasts and audiophiles and just a regular Joe who bought a stereo system. This is a period of time where things started to kind of like segregate itself into and being labeled as, I'm an audiophile, I'm just an audio enthusiast, I just own a stereo system. And this is when the audiophiles started to kind of like separate themselves. And this just reinforced itself in the 80s. So when PSB came on the market, they hit the market that kind of like captured the audio enthusiasts. Maybe not the audiophiles, but this is more for the people who wanted some better stuff than just ordinary regular stuff that you could buy at any big box store. These were a little bit more specified towards higher audio grade than some other run-of-the-mill speakers, and this hit the group of people that is the biggest. Everyday Joe who just buys some stereo, yeah, they buy a lot, but they buy a lot of shit. Then you have the audiophiles, who back then was a smaller group than the ones in the middle, who was an audio enthusiast that wanted to create something really nice sounding systems, but they didn't want to go to the low end, and they didn't want to spend gazillion of dollars on something that they didn't see necessary or fit for their needs. So PSB hit a market that was like a huge target for a huge group of people, and people responded to it in a very, very good way. So absolutely genius products. And I have to say, I have owned several pairs of PSB, both the smaller bookshelves and the towers, and I like the PSB sound. I never heard a PSB that sounded bad. And you can mix the PSB speakers with. You don't have to have 350 watt per channel amplifiers. They can do with fairly moderate amps to sound really good. The next one is a company that was also kind of like in the same boat as Bowers and Wilkins, and we're talking about Keith. Keith it was started in 1961 or something around there, 61, 62. I think it was 61. They kind of like in the beginning, they hit, and this was why they went out on the list. They they was targeting a very specific group of people. Very often, in the early days, they targeted people who with studio experience, studio monitoring and stuff like that, and hi-fi people that was kind of like in the music business. They didn't go out and cast a net on the whole audio business to begin with. It was not until later in the late 60s that things started to really, really pick up among the masses. And it kind of like, to me, it seems like it exploded in the time frame that we're talking about now, 1970 to 1990. So in the early 70s, mid 70s, late 70s, Keith really started to take more and more chunks of the market. And as more product came out, the more people started to pay attention to them, what they were doing. So Keith was a brand that had quite a bit of an influence on the market, because they kind of took that semi-pro studio thing and they kind of like merged it into the hi-fi scene, and they had some cool solutions in the beginning too. So they were kind of like one of the not pioneers, but they were one of the driving forces in the 70s and 80s. Maybe more so in Europe and Australia than, I don't know how it was here in North America, but in Europe and Australia, I think they did better there. So absolutely a good brand. They made some good speakers back then. They still do it. They have done that up through the years. So if you can come across some old Keith speakers, I say get them. The next one on the list is Mission. And Mission was started in the mid 70s in UK. It was an Iranian immigrant who moved from Iran to UK who started Mission. And they were one of the companies that also had a quick birth. They grew up fast and they got a lot of attention quickly. And they had some really cool, good sounding speakers. They were like a little bit outside the norm because, most speaker companies was like, you're going to look traditional, you're going to look nice and very well dressed, if you know what I mean, well dressed. Mission had like bold colors, not colors, but they had like a silver or white faceplate, and they had Mission written across them. It wasn't like very, very normal or the standard back then, but they were never the norm. They never cared about being the norm or the standard. They made their own thing, and when they came out and stuff, they made things with like plastic cones, see-through, clear, white, creamy white cones, instead of the black paper or the gray paper cones. So they kind of like went their own little way, diverting from the masses. And this is probably why they took off so fast, because people were like intrigued by it, and they went like, that's some cool speakers. They're different looking. And they were different sounding. I have had, up for the years, probably 8 or 9 different Mission speakers. And only one of them have really made me go like, this is nothing special. The other ones have been like, this is sounding good. This is good speakers. So it's clearly that they hit the head on the nail most of the time with most of the products. And maybe that's why they took off so fast. Because they came on the market and boom, they took off. Now we're coming to the last two on the list is, to me, some of the better sounding speakers that I have had and owned, and I really like a lot. I can start off with Snell. I think the whole name was Snell Acoustics, but then most people call them Snell. Um, they were founded in 1976, so that's about my mid 70s, and they have a huge wide range of products and speaker models. And they probably didn't have this, from what I've seen and heard and learned over the years. They didn't have that sudden impact right away in 1976. It took a couple of years, but as soon as they got some footing and they got their feet down and started running, oh yeah, they took off, and a lot of people got hooked on the Snell sound. And it's sad that they went out of business, because God knows what they could have made today. But while they were in business for many, many years, um, they really made some killer stuff. And I remember during the 80s, they had some really cool speakers. Um, and I loved it. I have owned about four, maybe five different Snell speakers. And I love them all. They were all really good. I didn't I didn't own any of the smaller models that they have. I had the mid-size and the bigger floor standing models, and I love the sound from the Snell. And Snell has a very, they are one of the speaker brands that, yes, they had a troubled past when they went out of business and stuff like that, but even in today's world, they have a cult status, and they have a big following of fans. And they have their own like history website or museum website online where you can go and look at all the models. So there's a lot of people caring about that brand because they made such a huge impact on many people. And they were kind of like when most speaker companies went small and medium in some types of period of time, Snell was no stranger to go big and build big speakers. So Snell is absolutely a brand that I would put on this list between 1970 and 1990 for sure. This last one is a speaker a brand that I have had. I've had many of them, and there's a reason why. Because when I heard my first brand speakers from this brand, I was mesmerized. I was taken away. Today they still make good stuff, but I feel that the older and the more vintage stuff has more charisma, it has more soul, it has more personality. Today there's so many brands out there that are kind of like mishmash mushed into get to each other, so they're kind of like, it's hard to stick out. But back in the day they really stuck out, and I love this brand. And this brand is Monitor Audio. They were also created in 1972. There was something about 72 and 73 for some freaking reason. 1972 was the birth date of Monitor Audio, and my first encounter with them was in 1985, 86, I think it was. And I just loved the sound when I heard them. I was just a young boy, young teen, and I was just like, wow, this sounds really good. And I think it was a Luxman amp that was driving them, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember what it was, but I think it was a Luxman. And it was really nice sound. And after that, I saved up some money, and because they were not cheap back in the day, and they're not cheap today either. So when I got older and I started making money and working and stuff, I saved up some money and I bought a couple of pairs of some used Monitor Audios, and I really liked them. And they had a good run in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. This is not a 90s list, but in the 90s they did really good. They had some really good models in the 90s, but let's focus on 70s and 80s. In the 70s and 80s, they were one of the few brands that was kind of like, okay, we're going to show you high quality sound. They were not like overpriced or like priced with a spoon and a fork and a knife. They were high priced, but they were considerably lower than some of the other brands, like that was like 10 times more. But the sound from Monitor Audio was so good they could rival brands that was costing 2 and 3 and 4 times as much many times, and used with good amplifiers. I remember when I had 2 Monitor Audio pairs. at the same time. And I remember I was using um, some it was electric company amplifiers, and I had I think it was a Curse or Mondial or something like that. I don't remember. It's so long ago. This was like early 90s, early to mid 90s. Um, 25, 30 years ago. So I think I had one 250 watt per channel electric company amp, and the Mondial was like 225 or 200 or something per channel. And the monitor audio speakers that I had was, both of them were tower speakers. I think one had two eights in it and the other one had two 6.5s or something like that, or two sevens. Because some of these monitor audios had like off-size woofers, but it sounded so good. And I used Denon CD player. I didn't have any. I didn't think I used any vinyl or turntable on there. I think it was just CD player. It was Denon. I remember that because I mostly use Denon when it comes to CD players and stuff. But I saw how much of an impact monitor audio have had on the world and the speaker business, because they kind of like took the high-end sound and they brought it down to a price level where more people could afford it. So they kind of paved the way for what you can call high-end audio, but it's not like the highest end audio, but they're high-end audio to a kind of like achievable price or affordable price. Not not affordable in that way, but they didn't cost an arm and a leg and your skull and your life, and you didn't have to sell your soul to the devil to get them. But you had to save up quite a few paychecks if you wanted to save up and get them, unless you bought them on credit. But so they were never cheap, but they were kind of like more affordable than the other brands that was like hyped up and costing a fortune. So monitor audio did something that not many other brands wanted to do, because if you take a high-end brand and you kind of price it a little bit lower, that can kind of like cloud your name and cloud your how people view your brand. But they were not afraid of that, so they put out some really good stuff, top-notch speakers. Maybe one of my favorite high-end speaker brands out there, along with Snell, in this period of time. And even today, I like maybe monitor audio and Snell more than some of the newer stuff that is out there, just because some of these older models and older brands, just like the previous list, they kind of like have that vibe and that feeling and that charisma and that personality, in both looks and sound. There's something about these speaker brands from the past that are just so cool. So that was the second list of top 12 speaker brands. This was between 1970 and 1990, which means I took it up to like end of 1989. The next list will be, I'll probably won't do 1990 to, well, we can do 1990 to today, until today. Because, I mean, I've done 2 decades on each of the other lists. So if I would do one more list with 2 decades, that would leave another list with 1 decade. So let's do the last list next time, which is 1990 up until 2020. That we can do. I think that will be okay. So just to recap today's list, the top 12s are Bowers & Wilkins, Sir & Vega, JBL, Advent, Altec, Magnapan, also called Magna Planner by many, Dolly, Keith, PSB, Mission, Snell, and Monitor Audio. That was the list for today with the top 12 models and top 12, well, not models, but speaker brands in this period of time. So make a comment below and tell us what your brand was that made a huge impact on you and your choice of speakers in this period, 1970 to 1990. Make a comment below and let's see what kind of brands of speakers you liked in this period of time. We all want to know. So until next time, take care.